Guy Felicella grew up in a middle-class home near Vancouver, BC, but early on fell into addiction, gangs, violence, and the prison system. He has many years now of recovery and has a family, including 3 children. He works in harm reduction, safe supply of drugs, and safe injection sites, in part because that's what saved his life. This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. I'm really happy to be here today with Guy Felicella. And I first saw him in an interview with Gabor Maté on the Wisdom of Trauma series. And he is an expert in harm reduction. He has a personal history with addiction. And I'd really like to jump in with that. Can you just kind of let people know a little bit about who you are and how you got to the kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, well, today I work as a peer clinical advisor for the BC Centre on Substance Use Vancouver Coastal Health's Regional Addiction Program, and then also I work for the Provincial Overdose Emergency Response Centre. I definitely, come from a background where there was a lot of trauma as a child, particularly verbal abuse, which was very dehumanizing for a young, formidable mind. I struggled with undiagnosed learning disabilities at a very young age, and so I looked for ways to, try to cope, and I did, cope by playing sports, but unfortunately, that's just not, something you can do every day, all day to cope. And then at a very early age, found myself running away from the environment that I grew up in and started venturing into the street with gangs and drugs and found substances. And when I found those substances at that early age, I honestly believed that they saved my life. And because of the way my life was going, I didn't really care to live the way I was living. And unfortunately, what happened with that is that it opened up a whole new environment of challenges such as homelessness and, being a juvenile with drugs and gangs, police, prison, juvenile detention center. And, sadly for me, I often describe it as prison was probably a safer place for me to be in than to be outside. And so my drug use just started to rapidly progress. And then I found myself really in a 2-block radius in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And I'd gone through, being forced through the foster care system. I was made a ward of the court at 14 by my parents, which meant the province now had control over where I would live and stay. And I have bounced around from group home to group home, foster home to foster home, school system to school system, and never had any stability there either. So started running away. Most of my youth was, either in foster care or homeless or incarcerated. And once you develop that kind of a pattern, attached with tremendous amounts of shame, it just became easy to continue that pattern in my adulthood. And it did so much where, I had to, I've survived the first dueling public health emergencies, which was the HIV/AIDS crisis and the overdose crisis in the 90s, where 1 in 4 people were infected with HIV in the area that I lived in the downtown east side. Survived 5 osteomyelitis bone infections for my left leg, 1 in my back, where I had to learn how to walk again. Survived decades of being homeless on the streets, and also survived 6 overdoses in 2012 and 2013, where I had to be brought back to life each time. And really then realized that if I didn't do something differently, that I wasn't going to be around much longer. And so I, battled to where I am today.
Mm-hmm. One thing that really strikes me, and this is true to my own experience too, is that there was something so wrong when you were a child and a teenager, such a lack of connection or caring, inclusion, so much shame that you feel like drugs were really what kept you alive. I do too. I don't think I would have survived without that. Um, Even though they also kill many people. But you talked about at the downtown east side. One of the things that always happened there was you always felt included, you always fit in. Isn't that ironic that that's where we get our feeling of inclusion is with other people who are just as traumatized and really struggling?
Yeah, it's definitely you could see you felt comfortable in knowing that you weren't alone. I
Mm,
think that's a big thing. Oftentimes, when you have shame, you think you're the only one carrying it, and then you could see other people carrying the same shame, just different circumstances and how they were feeling. Made it relatable for sure, and it made it comforting to know that there was other people that were supporting me while they were struggling as well. It's very interesting how pain and trauma work, and the process of like when you're in it. I mean, it's a lifelong journey to break free from, and I think you try to discover tools and tips and awareness. I think was huge in my life, especially of the learning disabilities, because everybody
mm,
constantly focused on the drugs, saying that the drugs were my problem. And I would get off drugs and be sober for 3 months, but my circumstances didn't change. And so I was often back homeless, back using drugs, back struggling with the pain. And eventually it was brought to my attention that and it was brought to my attention by Gabor Maté, that he said, I don't think the drugs are your problem. I think there's a reason why you use the drugs the way you do. And I never heard that before. And it kind of gave me the awareness that maybe there's a reason why I keep using the drugs the way I do, because I was confused by it. And discovering ADHD and a mild comprehension disorder similar to dyslexia really kind of made, and I felt stupid with those learning disabilities because I couldn't learn like everybody. I was often told in school, like, why can't you learn like Timmy or Jennifer? And I was just like, I don't know. And that was my best response. And put in a cubicle by myself, away from the classmates, centered out. I'm telling you, you don't share with people that you feel stupid. And I remember when I got the diagnosis, I was just saying, I've just really felt like I was a stupid person. And she says, no, you're actually very smart because of how you've had to navigate your life without the understanding of this or the support behind it. So she says, you've done really well just to get to this point. So and after that diagnosis, that really kind of alleviated and gave me a little bit of the self esteem that had been lost for so long.
right. I was at a talk several years ago with Henry Winkler, who played the Fonz on
Yeah,
Happy Days,
yeah,
and he has a learning disability, and he said he didn't realize it until his son, or his, I don't know if it was his son or daughter, but till his child was diagnosed, and he said, "Wow, that just made all the difference in the world to know that there was actually a problem with his brain." Yeah,
having that awareness was gave me really the ability to understand. Not only was I using drugs to numb the pain of the abuse, but I was also using drugs to numb the pain of the learning disabilities that I'd had in my life. And not knowing that, you're kind of often confused. Like, honestly, I tried every recovery program out there, and I keep thinking to myself, like, well, why isn't this working for me? What's wrong with me? And then I often reflected back to, well, you're just stupid.
right.
And
Which
once I discovered the learning disability and the way I learned, and then really molded a few platforms together and had support. I mean, things really rapidly started to change. And honestly, I had given up really on my aspirations and dreams in the downtown east side as well. Where I thought my best in life would be, getting a single room occupancy and maybe a disability file through welfare.
mhm,
And when I had the diagnosis and broke out of there, my thoughts were, well, I think I could do a lot better than that. Um, and getting around. people that were supporting me through this really changed the direction of my life. And the trauma therapy that I still go through today has really kind of just been the maintenance of getting through. It's a long, hard road in dealing with trauma as well. But at
Mhm.
least now the great thing is that I don't need the drugs anymore to cope with it.
Well, and before Dr. Maté brought this whole trauma awareness into the addiction field, it was a whole different understanding. So I find too that it's very helpful if we understand a little bit about trauma so that we can see that it's not me personally that's broken. There's something that's happened that's led to this, that's led to this. It leads to certain conditions in my brain development, in my nervous system. And so without that understanding of trauma, and I don't think we're very far along that road, but we're certainly farther than we were. So if we look at some of the work that you do is around safe injection sites and a safe supply of drugs. And I know a lot of people feel like that's not the right thing to do. We're just enabling drug addiction. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are some of the background things that people should know about that?
Well, if you actually you have to look at addiction in itself for people who are struggling with addiction. I was struggling with addiction before even I got introduced to harm reduction. So it's kind of like harm reduction doesn't create addiction. Harm reduction is a response to addiction, especially in today's day and age where people don't recover. If they use, they die. Yeah, and if we actually have harm reduction facilities and services in place, we reduce a bunch of harms in people's lives. But the biggest harm that you reduce is them dying. And then you have to understand all the other issues that are behind it. Like we're talking trauma, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, homelessness, poverty, all these other circumstances. That is the root cause of things.
Right.
And the drugs are the solution to those root causes. So harm reduction doesn't reduce actual poverty or homelessness, but what it does do is it gives the starting point of a relationship with an individual. And we often, most people, majority of people who use drugs are using alone and dying. And so what harm reduction does is it has a non-judgmental approach to invite people in. They're already using the drugs regardless.
Mhm.
If you look at the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s, before harm reduction was even a word, people used drugs even when it wasn't in place. So it doesn't to say that it enables people, or people are like, oh well, I can go to a supervised consumption site to now one's in my area, I may as well go inject drugs. That just doesn't happen. I couldn't imagine, a couple sitting around their breakfast table saying, "Oh, honey, a supervised injection site just opened up. Let's just go purchase some heroin and go use it." That doesn't exist. And I think in our society is that they often associate all the other issues with harm reduction. Now, harm reduction is not a reduction in poverty or homelessness. So you have those are separate issues. But I think what happens is a lot of society combines all those things into one and then points at harm reduction as the scapegoat. But I'm like, no, these are all separate issues. And
Mm.
so look, if harm reduction didn't exist, I wouldn't be on this interview wouldn't happen. My three beautiful kids wouldn't be on this earth. So when you really actually think about it, me going into a harm reduction facility instead of me using in a back alley was actually my first encounter with actually saying, I want to do this safer. And I also am looking and I'm searching for something different. And I was. And by going into using in a facility like that, build and people built the relationships that worked in those facilities, you know, at the supervised injection site at 9 a.m. in the morning, there's two lines, but often people just assume that everybody's going in there to inject drugs. There's also on the second floor a detox facility that is widely packed for people trying to get in. So But we are when we see that, we just say, "Oh, there they go again," and that's not the case. For some, yes, but there are two lines there, and eventually, many people bump over to the other line and back and forth, and have that ability to battle, to keep fighting each day, because they're worth it. And I think the moral compass towards people who use drugs really needs to change in our society because it's killing people and it's become just as deadly as the drugs themselves.
Hmm. It has, and there's a profound dehumanizing that happens when we don't feel that someone has the right to safe care, even if they're doing harm to themselves and injecting drugs. That just, I know there's been a bit of a shift in that with the opioid crisis, that now some of the people dying are white, they're middle class, their parents might be, a little bit more powerful or politicians or something. Do you see that things are changing, like in the police departments, politics? What's happening that might be encouraging or maybe not?
Well, I think there has been a shift, um, in how policy and procedure is looked upon, or how substance use is looked upon now as a health issue. I just
Hmm.
don't think we've pulled the trigger to actually get it done. I think, until you have stuff like, um, decriminalization, and a different form of regulation of substances, that create known doses of what people are actually consuming instead of buying it from the illicit market. I think if we get there, then I can guarantee you we'll definitely save a lot of lives. And I also think, a lot of people who are struggling with issues of a substance use disorder and addiction, I get so many calls every week from people looking for help and assistance. And one of the biggest things is honestly that we continue just to criminalize people who use drugs, but then we also criminalize people who go into recovery and change their lives because try renting a place to live, your criminal record, try getting a job. There's all these. We look at people's pasts. We don't ever think that in a society as ourselves, we really have to believe that people change.
Hmm.
And if given the opportunity, people can change. And then we have to support them the next steps of that instead of often reflecting back to, you did what? That's one of the main reasons why I share my story openly, is because I want people to know, like, besides all that, besides my lived experience, besides everything, that I have in my life, you know what? I'm a human being, made mistakes, um, but I'm also a husband, a father, a friend, that cares immensely about people in our society. And I understand pain. Um, and what often happens in people's lives is pain becomes their own excuse not to look outside to have empathy towards others.
Hmm.
So we have an empathy gap as well because our pain is somewhat selfish, where we don't have the ability to look at others. And that to me really has to change.
Yes, there's a lot of closed heartedness, a lot of people that are in a fight response saying things like, well, I got myself out of my rough childhood and I'm not using drugs. Why should they get that paid for or something? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear it all the time, and that's the part that you have to understand as well. And just as much as I had when I was diagnosed with the disabilities and the awareness, everything just started to click in place. And it was about 3 or 4 years later that I put all the pieces together.
Hmm.
And now is 9 years, almost 9 years sober. So when you actually think about it, I was still using these harm reduction facilities even back when I was going through it. And it gave me that ability to continue trying. We don't celebrate people trying.
Right.
We need to actually change. It's not about the amount of sobriety I have. Who cares?
Hmm.
Celebrate that people are trying. And I was a fighter and a battler that kept getting up every time I relapsed or fell down or got kicked out of a facility. I was a person that was just like, I'm gonna try it again. And so celebrate people's trying. And success is really in the eye of the beholder. I really don't care if people use drugs or not. I mean, what I care about is like, well, how do you feel? Like, does it improve the quality of your lives? And I know lots of people that still continue to use substances. Now it's just more manageable because they're not using these toxic substances. They're using
Right.
substances that improve the quality of their lives. And that's just, to me, it's just simple medication. And we get it through different ways. You could probably get medication going to the gym as medication for people.
Hmm.
We just have this divide of what's socially acceptable and what's not.
Yeah. And we shame people who are doing what's not socially acceptable. We celebrate people like who are working 80 hours a week, or
Yeah,
especially if they're
that's an
making
addiction in
money.
itself. Yeah, but we
Be
sell it,
there
we
too.
call that successful. Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, no,
Yeah.
probably not. Somewhere down the line, somebody's suffering. Um,
Yes. Yeah. An addiction to control, perfectionism, and all of those are really trauma responses. How do you feel now about the level of trauma informed care in the addiction field that you're kind of familiar with where you are?
well, I don't, trauma informed is one thing that I've often talked about, but it doesn't address trauma.
No,
I'd love to see trauma informed. I mean, if you're going to call yourself trauma informed, that's kind of like being a band aid to why not just go the full distance and let's be trauma informed, but also let's deal with the trauma. Or really, honestly, even at being even best trauma informed facilities can still cause people trauma.
oh, for
Uh,
sure. Yeah.
yeah, and so to me, it's kind of like I think we often look at like we're going to cover trauma therapy under MSP. That's going to cost a boatload of money.
Yep.
So being trauma informed is a couple of little programs that you have to do so you don't,
Mhm.
cause any more trauma. But you know what? People can be triggered by little tiny things that you may not even suspect would trigger them. So, are you really trauma informed? I often say, to the best of your ability, you try, which is good. But however, I think, if we look at the main driver of addiction, especially when it comes to addiction, is
Mhm.
trauma. We just don't do enough in dealing with people's trauma. And I believe me, a 90-day program isn't even going to dive into some people's traumas.
Right.
And so often you get what happened in my life is that they would often talk about the trauma that I caused others, which I did.
Oh,
But
okay.
however, without dealing with my own traumas
Mhm.
or validating that trauma, it was a cycle of feeling the guilt and the shame. And then the drugs became the immediate response to relieve that. And
Right.
that's why that revolving door or chronic, you hear chronic relapsing condition
Mhm.
is really because we haven't addressed or validated people's trauma that got them there in the first place.
We're facing a real crisis right now after, a year and a half in COVID, and there are big waiting lists for mental health services. There's a lot of people seeking them now, and there's no way that we can accommodate the number of people that need trauma therapy with the number of therapists that are around, or even I'm not a trauma therapist, although I work with people with trauma. Um, but there are not enough people to help. So when you look at what worked for you, one of the things you said was people cared about me. So people in the safe injection sites cared. They gave you all of the choice to do what you were doing, but they didn't shame you when you used, and they cared whether or not you recovered. So that's a big piece of it. What else do you think has to happen in terms of healing this large this widespread trauma that's going on in our culture and has been for decades, but it's just more on the surface, more known now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, poverty is traumatic.
Hmm.
I think, homelessness, um, these are real big issues in our society that we just haven't done a good job at addressing. We often look at the cheapest version and, like, you don't solve homelessness by creating more shelters.
Right.
You have to build homes for people to live in, and
Hmm.
then have the proper supports there as well. Trauma therapy is one avenue for people, but also, I think we could do a lot better in having outpatient trauma informed or trauma therapy practices, as well as inpatient in the recovery groups or the treatment industry, which should be contracting out some form of trauma therapist to actually come in to have some outside help as well, build the connection. Um, I think we're gonna have a massive mental health crisis. I mean, alcohol consumption, drug consumption has gone up dramatically since the pandemic. I
Hmm.
think people are, stressed, one paycheck away from being homeless as well. I mean, we
Hmm.
just, really what we've done is not much in changing the issues that have existed for very long, especially here in Vancouver. I mean, there's just more and more people homeless. And then now with the drug supply also on top of that being contaminated and poisoned and having benzos, people can't even get into detox because they have to go to a medical detox because
Hmm.
of benzo withdrawal can kill you. And then
Right.
after that, if you try to go into the treatment facility, there's a 3 week, 4 week wait list, which means you're back to the shelter to white knuckle it. I mean, we just haven't created a system that actually works for people. I think what we have is we've created a system that works for the system.
One of the arguments I've seen around homelessness and addressing it in a way where people are housed um, is that it saves us money. So that's one of the ways that we can convince people that maybe we should be humane in our approach to this, that it saves money. Um, there's a lot of different factors though around this, like people's anger at the system. People are also very much struggling. What's your sense of? And it's interesting that you have that experience with HIV as well as now with COVID. How have things changed? And downtown East Side or other places with COVID, how has that changed the opioid crisis?
And, you know, I think it's eerily familiar in seeing
Mm.
both from the 90s and where we are today. We haven't learned from how we treated people with HIV, AIDS, and drug use in the 90s. And here we are in 2021 going through the same circumstances again. And really, addressing the COVID crisis over the public health emergency where 6 people die every day. So not much. It's actually very traumatizing to see something that I had to go through in the 90s, but also to see people now going through it again, being a substance user. And here I'm on the other side
Mhm.
and seeing the same circumstances and issues and, people from society just piling on to people who are struggling and pointing fingers. And, oftentimes, people say, is the downtown east side, look at all the people that are out there. I said, well, look, yeah, there's nowhere to go.
Right.
Where can people actually go? They don't have a home. They don't
Yeah.
have a place to live. So this is not, and it all gets attached to one thing, and it's substance use. And I'm like, no, 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 this is actually what poverty looks like. And if you don't deal with poverty, and I've been to many places. I've been to Compton, Watts, the Mission District in San Francisco. where I was purchasing substances when I was there. But if you look at people who are struggling with poverty, they don't get support from society, so they'll have to deal with what they'll have to deal with to get out of that poverty. And one of the biggest things that is selling drugs to get out of poverty. And so then we blame them
Hmm.
for actually, living that lifestyle. And I'm like, yeah, but nobody's helping. It's kind of like what I used to describe going to prison. I would go to prison for going into the hospital, St. Paul's, and going into their storeroom and grabbing syringes because we couldn't get any on the street. And then I was arrested one time and charged with break and enter. And I remember even going to court. My lawyer goes, he's not breaking into something that's already open. And they said, yes, no, but he's actually still going there with the intent to steal. They dropped the charge to a lower charge. But I remember the judge saying to me, hospitals are where people help people, and what you're doing is not helping. And so he sentenced me to 6 months in prison. This is not for drugs. This is for just syringes that I had to steal. So that in a area where 1 in 4 were infected with HIV/AIDS. And I'm
Right.
like, and then when I'm completed my sentence, I'm dropped off at a bus stop with a welfare check, homeless, and then, hey, have a nice day. And you
Hmm.
see this is not rehabilitation, this is incarceration.
It is. Yeah. I worked in an AIDS organization in Calgary in the 87 to 94. And I really saw that progression from mostly being gay men and to intravenous drug users. And both of those groups are highly marginalized and nobody seemed to care. There was a lot of shaming, a lot of judgment. And it's just really hard to kind of look that in the face. People don't really care if these people ever die. So, without getting too deep into that, how do you keep your optimism and your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction? How does that work in your life now that you're clean, you're working on this? How does that go?
I have hope. I think I've always had hope. I've always felt that, under all my circumstances, that I'd always had this desire inside that I could accomplish something and be better as a person as well. And I think oftentimes pain reflects that in people's lives, where it gives you the ability to see things from a different perspective. And it sure has in my life, because from what I see, people struggling with the same desperation that I was once struggling with. And just being there and supporting people and saying hello. I find it's not rocket science. You don't really have to overthink kindness.
Mhm,
Um, I go to the downtown east side. To walk a half block might take 45 minutes because I stop and talk to so many people.
mhm,
And the reason why I do that is well, people want to talk, but also too, I know how important it was even in my own life. And so, you want to do what I want in my life is just to make it easier on people that are going through what I went through. And if I can do that in any way, and if that's just a conversation or a coffee here and there, or support getting them into a facility, or talking to a doctor for them, or
mhm,
you know those are the things that really you know um, bring hope to them. But also I'm hopeful too in every meeting that I'm in, to bring another model of safer supply, or decriminalization or recovery in people's lives. Then I know that there is hope and support. We just have to find that right connection for you. And
right,
oftentimes I just say to people, it's just, no, it's not that it's not working. We just haven't made the right connection yet. We're seeking the connection.
mhm,
And so I often say that to people. No, don't beat yourself up. You went in for 2 weeks, and yeah, but I'm using again. I go, yeah, but how long were you not using for?
mhm,
14 days. I was like, and how long have you had 14 days in your life? Oh, I can't even put that. I can't even think that. I'm
mhm,
like, well, then that is friggin' amazing that you got 14 days. Now, don't beat yourself up. This is just the way it is, and it's okay. And and then people are like, yeah, 14 days is a lot. And I'm going,
It
yeah,
is.
like,
Yeah.
that's, I always say the first 30 for me was, I mean, I tried so many times to get 30 days, I just couldn't get it. So
Mm,
I
mhm.
know getting 14, I'm like, man, that's the tough ones.
Those
Um,
are the first 14 are the really hard ones. Yeah.
oh,
Mhm.
painful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Physically and emotionally and yeah. So you talk to people in schools, you talk in workplaces, so you must see kids and parents.
yeah.
What would you say to a teenager or young adult who's started taking drugs, who's starting to see how scary that is and they don't want to do it? What kind of things would they need to know to really to work with this?
Yeah, well, a lot of the times too, with kids who are using substances, they're not, depending on, oftentimes, really, the majority of them use, it starts with probably alcohol,
Mhm,
marijuana, cannabis, um, and then, the possibility, one of the drugs that a lot of people use, especially in their youth, is Molly, um, which you know um, is concerning sometimes, just because that some of them have been contaminated, as well with fentanyl, but it is very rare. However, at the same time, awareness is huge for me in talking to kids,
mhm,
and giving kids the information that isn't scared straight. I never tell kids to use drugs. However, if they are using the harder drugs, I definitely tell them that they need to use them safely. And then, I go into my harm reduction, put on my harm reduction hat, and I'd be like, okay, well, who's got naloxone training?
mhm.
Who's the designated watcher at a party to watch out for people? And these are kids telling me, like, that this is what we want to do at a house party. We'll have a designated watcher, naloxone
Great
kits.
idea.
And
Yeah.
I was like, that's brilliant.
Mhm,
And then, you just, a lot of the times, one of the kids, who was, he was, using Xanax for a long time, and then he wanted to come off. So I helped navigate him to get to a doctor so that he could get on Suboxone, and that now he's not using anything.
mhm.
So it just depends, and youth are really, they know. I'm not a guy that's going to tell them to stop. That's not my job. There's a
Right.
difference. You
Mhm.
If just say no works, then why didn't it? I mean, you wouldn't need me
Yeah.
going into schools. And with parents, they deal with a lot of, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? And
Mhm.
they feel shame. I always tell them, I say, look, you know what? You're a good mom, okay? Like, I think what happens is, what people follow their path with their peers over best parenting.
Mhm.
Eventually, that's just the way it is. But however, because somebody's smoking a little bit of cannabis or drinking a little bit of alcohol, doesn't mean that they're going to develop a substance use disorder and addiction. However, the focus that you have on it is, obviously, you don't want your kids to use anything, but in doing so, in being angry and resentful and grounding them, and sealing them off from their friends, what does that do? It just puts a wedge between your relationship. Now the relationship is skewed, where they're not going to reach out to you anymore.
Right.
And now when they tell you they're going to the skate park, they're not going there either. So I'm like, don't flip out. It's okay.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Let them know that, hey, um, I I love you. I want you to know that, it's not something that, I envision that you would do, but I want you to also know that I want you to please be open with me. Um, and if there is any challenges that you're struggling, please come to me. I want to help. Changes the whole dynamic. And parents are often, I often say this to parents: how you view substance use in your own, like, life, or how you grew up. If your kids know that, and they ever do struggle with it, they won't reach out to you. And
Right.
and if you view it when you see it on the TV, like, oh, these people, or say stuff like that, that'll have a profound effect on how your kids will view it as well. And if they do struggle with it, they're not going to use you as a support group, because they're going to know how mom and dad thinks of it. It's
Yeah.
very, you have to be very articulate in saying, things like, wow, this is tragic, and have an open conversation at the dinner table. Hey, do you know that 6 people do die every day in our province? Like, do you have
Mm.
any ideas what we could do better?
Mhm.
Like, how can we help people? What can we do to help? As a family, you start having those conversations. That really, it's people just don't know how to start them.
Right.
Right. I
Right.
think that's been the biggest um, thing that I've understood in talking with a lot of parents. So like, yeah, but if I open the door, if I talk about it, maybe that opens the door for them. I'm like, well, no, I think the door is always that door can always open anytime. It doesn't have to come from you talking about it. So
Right. And part of it is we're drawn towards pleasure, and some of those drugs are fun, and some of it is we're socially included. So we're all together at a party, we're getting high, we're having a good time. And then the shame piece and the trauma piece. So it wasn't known before, but it seems to be pretty standard now that people who are using hard drugs, especially, but also a lot of other people, shopping addictions and gambling addictions and all kinds of things. And our nervous system and our brain are very set up to go towards the dopamine and go towards the pleasure stuff. So is that what you're seeing now? Is that there's really kind of a consensus that people who get addicted to hard drugs in particular, they have a trauma background? Is that pretty standard knowledge now?
oh yeah, like I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's really the root, like for the most part.
Right.
And it
Right.
could not even just be we're talking trauma can affect people in different ways. It can even be physical trauma, right? So I
Oh,
mean, yeah, it's
yeah.
not just the abusive mentally, physically, sexually. It can be physically as well. It can also be tied into your own low self-esteem as well as what you seek out. And a lot of it too is that peer pressure does does have you as
Mm,
a kid. The difference is you want to fit in, you want to be included, and
yeah.
if and even if it's uncomfortable, it might be something that you gravitate to just at that caliber of a person. I often say though, the major background though is the abuse that people
Right.
don't talk about and carry that shame inside.
Right. Right. It's really strikes me when you're working with a parent who says, I don't know how to open that conversation, that feeling that a kid has that nobody cares about me partly comes from the parent not being willing to engage in a really honest way. So, when I was a teenager, I was in lots of trouble and it was completely ignored. We're not going to talk about it, then it won't exist, which is also common in a lot of families. But I just was left feeling like I was completely on my own, and it would not have occurred to me to go to them for help because I would have just been shamed and in trouble. So, how can parents actually work with that in a way? Is it a courage issue? Is it like what could a parent do who's feeling like I feel disconnected from my kid? I know that that's a problem. What can I do?
I think best parenting is having humility.
Mhm.
Like, hey, I don't know how to bring this up, and I want to
Mm,
bring it up in a way that's you know honest, open. you know I don't have all the answers as a parent. My kids actually teach me, you know
right. Right.
and
Yeah.
I think you can have learning moments as a parent. I think you can actually, if you want to do something to really, I think what parents do, or what parents often do, is they try to protect everything around their child.
Right.
And so you have them in this protective bubble that you're so stressed about all the time trying to protect them that you often realize that you can't. You
Mhm.
absolutely can't protect them. And we don't show them what exists, really the reality in our society. We try to shelter them from it, but kids will figure it out for themselves. And what we have to do is we have to actually not live in this protective bubble where we say, this is the truths in the world that we haven't done a good job at. My generation failed. Your generation is feeling the impacts of this. The generation ahead of me failed. Now I
Mm.
want to give you the information. I think even we go into the downtown east side. Well, before COVID, we would go to, the Powell Street festivals and festivals in the downtown east side. My daughter was 4 at the time, and she saw a person sleeping on the street when we got out of the car. And she said, "Dad, why is the man sleeping on the street?" And
Mhm.
I told her, the perfect learning moment where I said, "You know what? Listen, like, we have a really good life, that we have a place to live, and you have a bed to sleep in. Sadly, this person doesn't. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the person."
Mhm.
And my daughter was, how much can you give a 4-year-old? Anyway, the next time we came back, we actually parked in the same area and we walked past the same. And my daughter remembered, and he wasn't there. And
Oh.
she said to me, Dad, the man that was sleeping here, he got a place to stay."
Oh.
And I said, "Gia, if the world thought like you, man, we'd be in a better place." And but
Mhm.
it was that moment where she remembered.
Right.
And so my kids have now asked questions, "Dad, what's drugs?"
Mhm.
And oftentimes when we hear the words drugs, we think of illicit substances. Well, I've talked to her, it's like, that candy bar is your drug, or the coffee that Dad drinks is Dad's drug.
Right.
I said there's just different forms of drugs and why we use them, why we need them. And for some people, that could be heroin. For some people, that can be caffeine, alcohol. There's Our society is, newsflash, advertising drugs everywhere. And so, like I've said, you can't have a hierarchy in drugs. And the reason why the drugs that are illicit cause more harm is because they're not regulated as other substances are.
Right. And I think until we really deal with the shame and the trauma, people need drugs. I mean, our nervous systems right now, it's so obvious. Everybody's really struggling, no matter if they're in a pretty comfortable position with COVID or not. Everybody's really struggling with the fear, the abrupt disruption. And I think sometimes we just need, or want at least, something to cushion that. And so, people with more money can cushion it in a more socially acceptable way generally. And
Yeah.
they're not on the street generally getting their drugs there, you know. So they have a protection against what we see. But I remember seeing this as a child, seeing people that were drunk on the street. And it was almost all indigenous people. I lived in Saskatchewan. And the white people who were addicted weren't on the street, they were at home. So to have that, I love that you have that opening of compassion and just honesty with your children. Like, this is actually how it is. And
Yeah.
no one person is to blame. And we all have a part to play. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I listen, I'll tell you, whether you're drinking on the street or drinking in a hotel or a penthouse, struggle with the same thing I struggled with,
Right.
isolation. And
Mm. Right.
and so don't matter. So oftentimes it's, I'll tell you, when I would go to treatment, I'd be hanging out with a lawyer and a fireman. And
Right.
here I am, the homeless guy from the downtown east side, but we laughed our heads off and had built a great friendship. But friendship wasn't built on, your hierarchy of job or anything. We understood each other because we struggled with the same thing, that
Mhm.
disease of isolation and
Mhm.
shame. And those are the two biggest diseases I know in people's lives that just cripple them.
Mhm. So if someone is maybe not in big trouble with drug use, but really feeling the isolation and the shame of not doing well in school, or all kinds of things that people feel shame about. Um, What are some things that might be helpful to come out of isolation? It's a hard thing to do, isn't it? To reach out to somebody.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the youth ask me this too. Hey, my friend so and so, he uses a little bit, he's kind of disconnected from me. What can I do? I said, well, what did you do before? Well, sometimes we would go to the movies, we would go to the mall, we'd go to the skate park, we'd hang out. Well, why not keep trying to do that? I said,
Mhm.
listen, you even calling somebody to include them in something like that, to let them know that, and also to, ask them, hey, what are you doing today? They'll say what they're doing and then be like, hey, can I come? Sure. Yeah, you can
Right,
come.
right.
That is huge. And then, you know what? It's not so much that you tell somebody, hey, I'm worried about you because you're using drugs. Just instead of saying that, just say, hey, I want you to know I care about you. And if there's anything I can do to help you, please
Let me know.
let me know. Instead of
Mm.
saying,
Right,
I'm worried that you're using drugs,
right.
you don't even have to say that. Just saying it, rephrasing it, it can mean the same thing. Like you are worried about the person, and that's valid. But the
Mhm.
way you say it has a profound effect on how somebody will react to it and respond to it. And so when somebody hears that and walks away, I heard it my whole life at harm reduction facilities. Hey, brother, I want you to know that I care about you. And if you ever need anything, you just let me know. And I was like, that means something. Telling
Right,
me the way I'm living my life when you don't know anything of it or
right.
what I'm going through and telling me I need to stop this
Yeah. Not gonna
doesn't do
help.
anything. You've
Right.
actually severed our relationship and now you've stood your ground on where you stand on it. And
Right.
I'm just gonna move on to the person that, I often say I've never forgotten how people made me feel. I've never, and nobody else will either. You'll never forget that. You'll always say, hey, that person made me feel, I remember that. And and that's where you'll go to. You want to be, if you're in this workforce trying to help people, then you think about that and don't
Yeah.
ever forget it.
Mhm. Well, and maybe just as we're finishing off, you had a beautiful quote at the end of that video that's on your website. The best things that have ever happened in my life have been because I've helped people, something like that. Do you remember the quote?
Yeah, I mean, everything I have in really in my life has been a direct result of giving back and helping others. I mean, you know what? Until you actually, if your life isn't going the greatest that it is, if you actually do something, that's the key to my success. Has just been paying it forward and giving back and giving back. You don't have to have boatloads of money to give back. You don't
You
have
don't?
to have any money to give back. What you have to have is just the ability to give time.
Mhm.
And time in our world is probably one of the most important things that you can give to somebody who's struggling.
And it's a
Time.
big way to reduce isolation as well. So you reduce your own isolation as well as making a connection with the other person.
Yep.
Yeah. Mhm. So how can people get a hold of you? Do you wanna just talk about your website and what's the best way?
Yeah. I mean, well, you can reach out to guyfelicella.com
Mhm.
or Twitter. I'm very active on as well.
Okay. Mhm.
At Guy Felicella on Twitter. You can reach out there or DM me on Twitter, or you can even go to my Instagram, which is Guy Felicella Public, and reach out there as well. And people reach out on all three,
Mhm.
and anybody that takes the time to actually send me an email or to reach out, I respond back because I know um, if they've taken the time to reach out, that I'm
Right.
going to take the time to respond. And It's developed into some great relationships, friendships as well, and support networks. And, I just try to um, help people any way I can, whether that's a family member that's struggling or a family that's struggling. And yeah, and I think that's the 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 paying it forward piece that really helps. And I don't charge people um, for reaching out and helping people. If I can help uh, get people into a facility or a program, that's all. That's all. I don't. I'm not an interventionist. I'm not a
Right.
person that tells people to get off drugs. I'm really just kind of a taxi driver that drops people off,
Uh,
um, and
right.
and then they can, if they need support after that, you can always call and reach out. So time's free, so I try to give my time as freely as possible to people because I remember that meant the most to me in my journey as well.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today. And I really appreciate your courage and your honesty and your authenticity and just that practical human to human respect and contact is so important. Yeah, so thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Lynn. Much appreciated.
This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. We have an exciting lineup for our fifth annual, including Dr. Gabor Maté as our keynote speaker. Head on over to radicalrecoverysummit.com to learn more and watch the interviews.